What's up, fellow Age Groupies? Welcome to another episode of the Age Groupies Podcast, part of the United WeCast Network. I'm Mike Ergo, and along with my co-host Lindsay, Hiken, we're here to talk to you about all things related to endurance sports from an amateur athlete perspective. We're here to talk about how to have fun along the way and stop taking ourselves so seriously all the time. You can follow the show on Instagram, at Age Groupies, join the Age Groupies page on Facebook, and look us up by name, Lindsay Hiken and Mike Ergo on Strava. If you have questions, comments, or topic ideas, feel free to email us. You can do that at agegroupies@gmail.com. And if you guys enjoy the show, please leave us a rating and review on iTunes or wherever you get that podcast. Today, our guest is Simon Ward of High Performance Human. Simon has 30 years of triathlon experience, including 20 as a coach, tutor, and coach educator. Simon's a firm believer that for age group athletes, we should be doing as little as necessary to continue improving rather than as much as possible. He's a big believer in helping people achieve the balance in training, work, family, and social life. You all can connect with Simon by looking at today's show notes. I had a really good time interviewing Simon. I love his philosophy on training and bringing some enjoyment to the sport and keeping that work-life training balance. All right, guys, let's get to the interview. Simon, glad to have you on this show. Welcome to the show, man.
No, thank you for inviting me, Mike. It's a pleasure, and it's been a while, hasn't it? Trying to coordinate time zones and travel arrangements.
No kidding. Like we were talking about earlier, it's tough enough just to get aligned when you're on the same time zone, let alone different part of the country, let alone a different country, different continent. So, hey, we made it happen. This is pretty cool.
Well, you get started early, don't you? It's, what is it, 6 a.m. your time, 6:09?
Yeah, I'm not quite as early as I don't get up quite as early as Jocko Willink, the 4:30, but sometimes I do. I'm up either 4 or 5. I mean, with kids and trying to fit in any kind of a endurance training, it's got to be up early or I'm not going to get it done at all.
Yeah, well, you do well, man. You do well.
Well, thank you. So you've been around the world lately since we talked last. You've been out to Kona. You've been out to, was it Colorado? You've been out to all kinds of places.
Yeah, I did a bit. I started off in Colorado and then I ended up in Kona. It was the other way around.
Okay, not too bad. So you worked your way west.
Chasing the sunshine in the warm weather.
Well, I don't blame you. Well, I wanted to ask you a little bit about yourself and ask you how you got involved in the sport of triathlon. I know you've been a trainer for about 25 years now?
Yeah, coaching since the mid-90s. I started, my first triathlon was in late September 1987. I'd been to Australia for a year, so I'd finished at university. I took a year to go and travel around Australia. Triathlon had been going in, the first Hawaii Ironman was 1978, so there'd been triathlons for 10 years. I saw the beach Ironman thing in Sydney and in Melbourne, which is surf skis and more to do with surf life saving. But I saw this thing called a triathlon, and I read a little about it and thought that looks cool. I never got to try one over there, but then when I got home, I took a temporary job in a bar, and we have a thing in the UK called Children in Need, which is a huge, great big charity fundraiser that's televised now, and they raise 40, 50 million pounds commonly now, and it's been going for many years. So as part of that, at the pub, everybody had to take on a challenge, and I decided I always like to do something different to what most people do and a little bit harder. So I sort of, maybe stupidly, I said, I'm going to do this triathlon. I could swim. I've been doing lots of cycling in Australia. I used to run regularly, but I wouldn't have called myself an endurance athlete. And so I picked this one that spookily, it's in a pool that's a couple of miles from where I now live. So that was my first introduction. It was a pool swim. I think it was 400 or 500 meters. And then you had to do the run next. And you had a 15-minute gap between the swim and the run. And then when you finished the run, you had a 15-minute gap, and you got your bike and you went and did the bike. And then at the end of it, they had the little 4x3 card. Everything was written down on on paper. There was no computers doing anything then apart from somebody diligently typing something up into a BBC microcomputer. And then several weeks later, you got this stamp addressed envelope that you'd written with your own handwriting on, addressed to yourself with the results. And old school's lovely. I'd love to go back to that now.
Oh yeah. Well, even though it was, I guess relatively new back then, even today, trying to explain to people what a triathlon is it can be mind-boggling for some people, getting the terms marathon, triathlon, pentathlon, like decathlon, everything confused. Let me ask you, after you finished the first one, did you know you were hooked, or was it kind of like maybe a one-off?
No, I was hooked. Yeah, I had a blast. And I suppose the fact that there was a little gap between the three events meant that you perhaps weren't as fatigued. You went and did everyone as hard as you could, and that was how I thought you were supposed to do it then. There was no pacing, just sprint the swim, get out, have a breather, then go and do the run, and then do the bike. Yeah, and I trained through the winter. I thought I was training. I bought Dave Scott's training manual, tried to follow Dave Scott's training plan, which nearly killed me because it was Dave Scott.
I don't know how he followed that. Just reading the accounts of him in Iron War, just trying to he went all out every day forever, and that guy had no quit. So the fact that you survived that is probably a miracle.
Well, yeah, I wouldn't say I survived. I've spoken to Dave. I've told Dave about this, and he chuckled. I think he probably laughed actually more than chuckled. There was a running session which was 7 times 1 mile interval at around 85 to 90% of maximal heart rate. So I thought, okay, let's try that. I got to the end of the first mile, which probably took me about 7 minutes. And I thought, I can't do another one, never mind 6 more.
Yeah.
And at that point, I realized that the training programs of elite athletes needed to be watered down a little bit for us normal people.
Yeah, it's the difference between when you see the workouts prescribed to these pros and people who've been doing the sport for a while, or perhaps have a genetic advantage on us, and trying to see how it applies to the rest of us. When did you go from just competing or participating in triathlons to coaching other people? What was the gap, or what was the bridge there?
Well, my first triathlon was in '87. I then did my first season in 1988, and at that time I'd read about Ironman, and that was my ultimate goal. But at that time, I guess we were all a little bit more sensible than perhaps some people are today. So I decided to work my way up slowly. I was working. I had a conventional job then. I was in sales. And then I got made redundant a couple of times. In 1993, I'd always had this idea I was going to set myself up as a personal training business. So I started doing that in 1993. In 1995, I did my first Ironman in Penticton in Canada. And on the back of that, I wrote an article, submitted it to a magazine, and they published it. Somebody else asked me to write an article for a magazine, a specific triathlon magazine this was. And as part payment, I thought, well, maybe there's some coaching I could do here. So I asked if they could put a little classified ad in the back of the magazine with a link from the bio at the bottom of the article. And on the back of that, a month or two later, not only did they ask me to write some more articles about training for triathlon, some people started to write to me and ask. Remember, again, this is when the internet was just starting, so I didn't have a computer then. So I got this nice letter, handwritten letter from somebody asking me if I'd train them or if they could have a questionnaire. And that was it. There wasn't really a formal coaching program, triathlon coaching program in the UK then. So most of what I did was based on my own understanding of training, from my own training, what I'd read in Dave Scott's manual and others, and just some understanding of anatomy and physiology from being a personal trainer, and it sort of blossomed from there, really.
And so, okay, so this comes up. I think you said about 95. You started coaching full time and training people.
Well, I wasn't really coaching full time then. I had a full time personal training business, and that was mostly what I was doing. Yeah, and then the coaching grew slowly. in the year 2000, I took on a partner because I was getting too many inquiries by then. I had the personal training business until probably about 2012, 2013. So I had that for 20 years. And then I decided I was going to go all in with the triathlon training. But up until that point, it was sort of an even balance in terms of my income stream.
What kind of distances were people trying to go for? Was it everything from sprint to an Ironman, or were people gravitating towards the shorter courses like sprints and Olympics?
No, it was a mix to start with. But there was definitely a trend as my experience grew towards people wanting to go for Ironman. And I was writing at the beginning of full-time coaches in the UK. There wasn't many of us. And I wanted to tie my coaching to the mast of Ironman and specifically work on helping people train for Ironman. My business partner, who worked with the Brownlees and ran the high performance centre in Leeds, he was more focused on shorter distance racing because of what he was doing with the Brownlees, and so that was where his interest was. So that was how we divided inquiries. He did the shorter stuff, I did the longer stuff. But there's definitely been a trend over the years for people to see that shorter distances are just a warm up for getting ready for Ironman, and they want to do a couple of those. They see them as, it seems like a lot of people see those shorter distances as being slightly insignificant, and the only thing that really counts is whether you've done an Ironman, which I find that bizarre and slightly unfair.
Yeah, it's trying to I don't know. We don't apply the same standards to sprints, like fast running, sprinting, and a marathon. It's in the Olympics, like both of them are getting gold medals. But you're right. I think it seems like I've seen a trend with people just talking about, oh, these are all leading up to doing an Ironman, and that is their ultimate goal. But I'll tell you what, man, going back to a sprint this last year, you can get just as tired because you can go as fast as you humanly can. So it is kind of weird that way, but it seems like Ironman is definitely like the standard these days.
Yeah, the thing with Ironman is that the training time occupies so much of your life. It seems, for a lot of people, it seems to occupy all of their life and all of their thoughts, and they move away from thinking about members of their family. They maybe take their eye off the ball at work, or they're trying to juggle all these balls. And when you've seen those jugglers, when it gets out of control and you think they're going to drop something, I sometimes think that's what a lot of people training for Ironman are like. And the ball that they often drop is with their own health or with their friends. But sprint distance and standard distance triathlons are so much easier to fit into an everyday life. They're still hard work. You're still doing a triathlete doing a standard distance triathlon will still do more running or more training probably than an elite marathon runner.
Yeah.
In terms of total training, but it's just spread across 3 disciplines. But if you're doing 10 hours a week or 8 to 10 hours a week training for a standard distance race, that's a lot of training.
Definitely. Yeah, it is. That's a lot of training. So it's a nice segue into, the work-life, balance, it goes into setting up a training schedule and the mental health. So I've seen in the triathlon community, I've seen people, you talk about juggling, drop the ball with family. I've done that. Drop the ball with work, social life, everything. And there's a preoccupation, maybe not quite an obsession, but it gets to that point with finishing an Ironman or finishing that race. So why does this happen in your opinion? And what do you do when you're coaching people to help them keep that balance?
I think that a lot of people that come into triathlon, particularly those who want to do an Ironman, have already got busy lives. It's typical to find somebody come in and they say, right, well, I work 60 hours a week. I've got 3 children. One of them's just finishing their exams. One of them's going to university. One of them's just changing to big school. I've got a responsible, demanding job. I've got a lot of travel, but I've got a few spare hours, and I'm success oriented. I'm goal driven. I'm gonna do an Ironman because, as we just said, that's the only thing that matters. Is doing an Ironman, and I can fit it in, and they perhaps don't realize the demands on their time and on their body from taking such a decision. I then believe that a lot of people are swayed on the amount of training they need to do by social media. They look at what other people are doing. They read these stories of people doing 15 or 20 hours a week and believe that if you're going to do an event that's going to take 15 to 17 hours for some people, that's the amount of training that you need to do in order to prepare for that. And so then they're trying to fit that into this busy life that they've already got. And of course, no matter how busy you are and how clever you are with your time, there's only ever going to be 168 hours in a week.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
always.
There's only so many ways you can split that pie up. And nearly always the things that get pushed to the side in a bid to do the training. You know, you and I, Mike, we know that training isn't just about physical activity. It's all about allowing the body time to adapt and recover. So there's got to be some rest in there. There's got to be some strength training. There's got to be a lot of mobility work. That takes time, but they get pushed to the side. And it's fairly common to hear athletes say, well, it's okay. In order to get this session done, I'll join Jocko's 4:30 club. I've heard his podcast. You know, I've listened to Dave Goggins saying he gets up at 5 and attacks a day. So I'm going to do that as well. I'm going to get up earlier to fit that training session in 3 times a week. And so now they're cutting back on sleep to make time for training, and there goes some of your recovery time. And then, of course, once you stop losing sleep, you don't recover as well. You perhaps become a bit more irritable because you're not resting. So then your irritability flows over into other areas of your life. You take it out on those closest to you, take it out on your colleagues. You perhaps don't think as sharply. Your mind's a bit, cloudy and cluttered. So you may be dropping the ball at work. It's very easy for all of those dominoes to start falling over.
Yeah. I've seen it happen, and I've felt it too. Especially with a build up and starting to peak in training. But it seems like there's a certain kind of person too who's drawn to fitting as much or as many activities as possible during the week. Like you said, busy job, lots of family, lots of social stuff, and then trying to fit in, an Ironman training schedule into that as well. Like I get this picture in my head of someone like, cramming things into a suitcase and like stepping on it to try to get it to zip up, get every last cubic centimeter out of it. What kind of ways do you help people figure out this balance when you're coaching them of not to, getting away from the more is better?
I think, again, part of the problem with trying to cram that in is there's a finite deadline. So all of this stuff has to be fitted in order to achieve this goal by next August, as if the world's going to end the day after. And so it has to be done by then. There's no negotiation. Taking a long-term view and seeing it as a journey. I mean, I never thought that I will still be doing triathlon. Next year will be my 33rd year. When I do Ironman Canada next year, it'll be 25 years since my first one. I never thought that I would be still doing triathlon 25 years later. And if I was to go back in time now, I would have said to myself, well, there's no need to achieve all these things by the time of your next race. Let's just use next race, do what we can, and then use that as a stepping stone to the next one and the next one. And let's keep going on that journey. So I do try to encourage people to think long term. And I think that placing health above fitness is more important, because if you're not healthy, you can't do the fitness training anyway. If you're not mentally healthy, if you're not physically healthy, if you're carrying some sort of illness that requires medication, if you're carrying some sort of injury, you can never train efficiently and recover efficiently. So that's got to be a priority. And we all, let's take brushing your teeth. You brush your teeth, you're going to brush your teeth twice a day for the rest of your life. So as long as you do enough to keep your teeth in good shape, you can just keep that ball rolling. Well, it's the same with fitness. So if we take the approach that we can keep doing this stuff for the rest of the life, then there's no need to do these massive sessions now. There's no need to try and force all of that stuff into the suitcase. We can sort of spread it out and maybe give the suitcase a bit more space. So we look at what's in their life. We look at what they're going to feasibly be able to achieve in the 9 months up to that event. I try to get them to think beyond that. So what happens when you've done that event, and what about the next one? We do an analysis of their life, an audit, if you like, of what time they have to commit to family, to work, to sleep, to travel, to all of those little tasks we have in the day that we forget about, but which take up time. And then whatever we've got left, we could perhaps give towards training, but bearing in mind that the more training you add on, the more recovery time you add on. So once you start stealing, you're stealing from one, you're stealing from Peter to pay Paul.
Then come from somewhere. Yeah.
Yeah. So we try and then I also look at the training history. What have you been doing up to now? If you've only ever been training an hour a day, suddenly going up to 3 hours a day is going to result in something breaking down. So we don't want that to happen either. We want to try and create a consistent training program. So we've got all of these little areas now. Excuse me. It's a bit like a Venn diagram. And what we want to try and do is find the sweet spot, the area in the middle where they're going to move towards their goal effectively. They're going to be able to create some overload and adapt to it, but they're also going to be able to live and maintain the rest of the commitments in their life. And we have some crucial conversations again about, maybe doing an Ironman next year isn't feasible for you right now. It doesn't mean it never will be, but given everything you've got on, maybe this should be put back a year or two so you can give yourself more space. Or, okay, you're going to do an Ironman, but maybe that goal of going sub 10 hours is something that's for the long term, not the short term.
Yeah. My friend Rob went from being, a clinical psychologist to, full-time coach in triathlon. And he says now that he does more psychology than he did back then. So do you feel like a part of the time you have to play people's therapist and help them figure out their mental processes?
Yeah, all the time. And yeah, I'm a coach educator as well for British Triathlon. And we have a lot of people that come along that read a lot. They're very knowledgeable. They understand anatomy and physiology. They can write a great program out. They can write great swim sets. They often try and apply these swim sets to all the same training to a range of different people. And each of those people are individual. They have different requirements. They have different ages, genders, experiences, physical attributes and deficiencies. But the thing that often they forget is that you're dealing with this individual who has different belief systems, different drivers, different pressures on their life, different baggage that they're carrying around on their back, that they've been collecting over the years. And each of these seemingly often ignored aspects are the things that are really going to be the obstacles to progress for an athlete. We've talked about mental health, Mike, so we could focus on that. If somebody has some issues, some anxiety issues, if they have problems sleeping because of things that have happened in their past, this is going to lead to stress, which affects your ability to cope with things. And ultimately that leads to a breakdown of some sort. It might be a mental breakdown because it just becomes overwhelming, or it might be a physical breakdown because you're not sleeping. But particularly with triathletes, and you'll have seen this as well, you don't usually have to motivate them to go and do the training. They're not like my personal training clients who I sometimes had to ring them up and say, making sure they were coming to the gym tomorrow. I never have to do that with triathletes, but I do have to hold them back, and I do have to stop them doing too much, and I do often have to have conversations about insecurities and about how they're feeling in their head.
Yeah, so it seems like the people, and I can see this in my own life too, people trying to use the training and these races to compensate for something else going on in their life, whether it's having depression, anxiety, or other things that aren't just working out well. And like you said, you have to pull the reins back on them, because most of us want to do too much as opposed to do too little. What do you do? How do you have those conversations with people?
Well, a lot of the people I coach are remote. Actually, using something like we're using now, using Zoom helps, because you and I are looking at each other across video.
Yeah.
we're not going to share that with the public, but you and I can see each other. So I can see in your face that you're smiling, that you look like you've rested, that you look healthy. But if you were having a bad day, if you were an athlete that I was coaching and things weren't going so well, I'd probably see a different picture. And so that tells me several things. I get them to fill in training diaries using Training Peaks, and I ask them to write comments, and I can tell how somebody's doing often by how diligent they are at keeping those diaries. Often if they're on top of everything, a session data will be uploaded very quickly. They will write notes. It will be kept up to date that day. If things are getting on top of them at home or at work, maybe it'll be done at the end of the week because they don't have time or they're just not motivated. They may just upload the Garmin or the Sunto data, but they won't put any comments. They don't do the daily metrics. They maybe miss phone calls that we have prearranged. So those give me little clues.
Yeah. So you read between the lines on a lot of these things.
Oh, I think you have to. You can't just look at the data that tells you how fast somebody's run or for how long or how far they've run, because that's just objective data. It's what's going on in the head that's going to be the limit on what people can achieve.
I think that's what a lot of people might not understand, is that if you are prone to being stressed out, have a high level of anxiety, that means that's less time your body is going to be in the parasympathetic state and the rest and digest and recovery. And so it's going to be harder for your body to recover between sessions. And I mean, and like you've probably seen, it just spirals. Like it's one thing, maybe they start losing sleep, and then the next workout's not as good, so their mood declines, and then it just kind of goes from there. And if you see somebody that's in a bad way or getting into one of these patterns, what do you do to help them, get back on the right track?
The most difficult thing, you mentioned earlier that a lot of people will find solace in exercise. It's almost a way of running away from their problems.
Oh, yeah.
And hiding from their problems. You can see, I look at people when they're running and they've got this anguished look on their face. They're playing loud music. They look like they're forcing themselves into it as a punishment for something. Or they, you feel like when you're watching them, there's somebody coming around the corner after them that they're running away from. Maybe it's imaginary, but there's something that they're running away from. I sort of often want to stop people and say, what are you running away from? So if you ask them to stop exercising or slow down, that could be counterproductive. So we have to have framed the situation at some point in the past with conversations like, my job as your coach isn't to tell you what to do. It's like satellite navigation. You've asked me to help you get from A to B. And you've asked me you've given me these parameters of when you can train, what you can train, what you're aiming for. And I've suggested some routes, and now you want me to help keep you on that path to get you to that goal. And sometimes I'm going to suggest detours like satellite navigation will, to help you avoid a roadblock that I can see.
That's a good analogy. I like that.
Yeah, I can see a roadblock coming up because I'm the satellite and I'm looking down, whereas you're driving the car and you're in the middle of the city and you can't see the roadblock because it's around the corner and there's some big buildings in the way. And so I might, even though it might seem illogical to you, I might suggest that in turning left, you turn right and you take a longer route to get around there, because actually it'll be an easier and less troublesome route. And we trust our sat nav, don't we? We trust the sat nav. If it tells us that we're going to avoid a roadblock, we trust it because we understand that's what it does. And so it's about setting those situations up in advance, so that when I say to you or another athlete, listen, Mike, I think in order to avoid this roadblock, I think you need to take your foot off the gas a bit, coast along, maybe do a little less, maybe take this different route here, which means just doing some easy training or going to yoga instead of going to the pool. Hopefully we've built up some trust by then, and they can see that is going to be a better path in the long run. And again, we come back to taking a long-term approach rather than it all has to be done now because I have to have this thing cracked by August next year. And if I miss a day, then that's going to upset my goals.
Yeah, those arbitrary deadlines are so fascinating to me because I've set them And I know what it means to have so much built up mentally, the expectations that I have to have this accomplished by X date without even checking that we set this date arbitrarily. There's no doomsday clock ticking. There's nothing in particular that made us choose that date other than maybe that's when a race was, or when we just kind of looked at a map and threw a dart and said, okay, right here and now is like when I want to have this big accomplishment done by. But you're right. Without checking back on like, okay, why was this set up in the first place, and what are my actual goals? It's interesting you bring up the longevity of the sport, because that's the approach I've taken of just wanting to do this for years and years to come because I enjoy it. And you might argue that I've never been a really threatening podium, so it's easier to take that approach, but it takes the pressure off immensely. So is that a hard sell for some people to get back and step away from these arbitrary dates?
It is for some people. I suppose as I've gained experience and wisdom, and I've made these mistakes myself, I've realised that a long-term approach is just better. What I've also been able to do as I've gained experience and knowledge as a coach is to try to be more certain in the type of people I want to attract as clients. So I'm much more careful now about the people I take on. Their goals have to be aligned with my goals. So I'm not really that bothered about somebody who is a one and done person. They just want to do an Ironman by March next year. They've got to fit it into the next 4 months, and then they're moving on to the next project, which is to run across the desert or climb Mount Everest. And then they're going to spend the next year going from zero to high altitude mountain climber, and then try and climb Mount Everest and all the rest of it. And then when they've done that, they're going to try and swim across the Atlantic. I'm interested in working with somebody who says, look, I've got a long-term plan in my life. I want to do an Ironman, and I want to swim across the channel, and I want to climb Mount Everest, but I'd like to spend the next 10 years preparing again in the skills and fitting this in with my life as the CEO of a big company, and I've got a wife and 2 children. That interests me, and we have conversations when we start about how I like to help people and what they're trying to achieve. And if we find that there's common ground, then that provides a good match.
Yeah.
So part of what I do now is really based around what my philosophies are. And so, a bit like you with your podcast, people get a feel for who you are and what your philosophies and life goals are. And if you were coaching, they'd be attracted to that, and they'd write and ask you. So I find that people listening to my podcast or reading my blogs will think, oh, I quite like Simon's approach to life. I'd like to be coached by somebody like that. Whereas there are some coaches out there who just want to throw lots of training at people, beast them really hard, like your Marine commander, and
exactly,
and get them. They want that military approach, and that's fine. They find a coach that's going to help them through that lens.
Yeah, the fit is so important. In my life professionally, as a therapist, it's huge, because I could be great for one person, but terrible for another person. I mean, that fit, how you connect and how you communicate, the understanding you have is crucial to any kind of success. Can you think of some of the moments that really made you proud as a coach?
All of them, really, in some way. You mentioned going to Kona. I got the chance to go to Hawaii in 2002 when I'd started working for CompuTrainer, who are defunct now, but they were the best indoor trainer of that sort of generation. And they invited me to go out there and support them on the booth in the expo. And I had a couple of athletes that were out there racing, so I got to see them compete. And one of them finished with about 20 minutes to spare. So, after 11:30, pushing the deadline, Mike Riley sort of calling home individual people arriving out of the darkness. And then there they were. Man, I had a lump in my throat when they crossed the line. I sort of had a tear in my eye when I went to the behind the finish line and walked with them into the athlete garden and helped them collect that medal. And that was because they'd had this lifelong ambition to go there, and finally they'd achieved it. And it wasn't really an emotion for me. It was an emotion for watching them sort of achieve this thing that they weren't sure was possible, and doing it with their friends and their family there. So every time I've waited for somebody at the finish line, and if you're finishing in 16 and a half hours, it's quite probable that you are one of the older athletes. And I'm talking about, one of the older athletes in the older age group, sort of 60 plus. It's quite probable that you are not a natural endurance athlete, and that you've had a lot of challenges to overcome. So you might be a para athlete with some sort of disability that's limited you throughout your life, but you found an outlet. It might be that you had significant challenges. You were an athlete who could come home in 10 or 12 or 13 hours, but you had significant challenges on the day. So you might have had a bike crash and injured yourself. You might have been stung by a jellyfish. You might have had really bad vomiting and diarrhea. So something that's really derailed your performance and given you, so for all of those people, there's multiple opportunities either during training or during the event not to do these things. And we're talking about Team Never Quit podcast. Well, these people could be part of Team Never Quit because they didn't. They could have done and they didn't. And that, when you see those people coming across the finish line having shown that sort of resilience, that's equally emotional, maybe more so, because if you've done it yourself, you've overcome a lot in your life, and when you recognize that in somebody else, you know what they've been through to get to that point.
I think so. I think you're right, and I remember reading that most of us are inspired more by someone who's more like us than if we see ourselves as maybe lower in ability physically than some of the pro athletes. That we get inspired by seeing that person coming at 16 hours and 55 minutes, or seeing that there's something about the humanity that comes across when you see somebody who's really gritting it out and who has overcome a lot, like you said, and that just jerks at the heartstrings there.
It does, and but there will be people who take issue with my next comment, but I love to see that all Ironmans, but I think that if we lost that in Ironman Hawaii, it would be a tragedy. Right from the very beginning, Valerie Silk, who owned the race back in the 80s, wanted to make sure that it wasn't just for the elite athletes. And that day it was Dave Scott and Scott Tinley and Scott Molina and Paula Newby-Fraser, but she wanted to make sure that the everyman, the Ken Shirk, Mr. Cowman, that he got a chance to finish in 15 or 16 hours, that the guy who rode on his cruiser that just learnt to swim got a chance to finish, because they were the characters that shaped the race. They were the ones that, sure, the NBC story showed the winners coming across, but then that footage where you see the guys and the girls that have had those challenges, and as you say, those are the average viewer watching is inspired by that. That guy's only got one leg and he's got a prosthetic and he's finished an Ironman. Man, if he can do it, there's no limits to what can be achieved if you just put your mind to it.
Yeah. I
hope that those people always get an opportunity to race in Kona, because why shouldn't they?
Yeah, I'm with you, and I'm obviously biased because that's how they got me there a couple of years ago.
Well, that's I was there on the legacy ticket as well, so I was one of those who didn't qualify directly, but qualified through gaining enough loyalty points and some persistence.
Yeah, exactly, loyalty points. I like it.
Yeah.
In some ways, that's more impressive to be able to stick it out for that long. The longevity of the sport is that, man. Well, let me ask you this: what, for people who are considering getting a coach, what are the advantages of having a coach, and when who's the kind of person who needs a coach?
Well, we all need somebody to talk to, right? When we're going through our life, we all have somebody that we like to pick up the phone or have a coffee with or have a beer with to just check in and am I on the right track here? Am I doing the right thing? Or maybe did I do something wrong? What was it? That friend who can be honest with us and tell us that we're making an ass of ourselves.
Oh God, yeah, the objective feedback.
Yeah, so we all need somebody to be accountable to, and often being accountable to ourselves isn't the right thing, because we do the things that we like and we stay on the paths that we know, and perhaps we continue to make those mistakes again unless they're pointed out. So I think everybody can benefit from a coach. There are many different coaches out there who operate in different ways. There's the ones that I mentioned earlier, the military style coaches who favor the shout at you and give you lots of training and no pain, no gain. And there's nothing wrong with that. And there are people who like that sort of coach. And so for that sort of athlete, there is a coach. And for that sort of coach, there is an athlete. There are the nurturing coaches, the ones who want to understand a person and understand what goes on in their life and maybe look at things through a different lens. So I think that if I was looking for a coach, I would follow Henry Ford's advice. I would hire slow, and I would take my time. I would look around. I would listen to podcasts, because I think podcasts give you more of a sense of somebody's beliefs and philosophies than perhaps a blog post does. I would talk to other athletes. I would decide what I wanted a coach for. Some people do just definitely want to have a training program, and having a training, even if you've got all of the anatomy and physiology knowledge in the world, having somebody write a training program for you takes away a lot of stress, because it's one less thing you have to do. You can just
oh my God, immense amount of stress taken away.
So you may just want a coach who's going to give you structure, but you may want a coach who's going to look at other aspects of your life, who's going to help you fit everything in almost like a life coach, which is sort of like the area and the direction I'm taking. So you listen to podcasts, you read blogs, you find coaches who have an outlook on life that aligns with yours. You speak to them. You speak with them face to face if you can. You find out what they're offering. Obviously, there's most coaches are going to charge for that, so there's a budgetary constraint as well, and you have to find somebody whose budget, whose fees align with your budget. You may want a coach that's local to you, or you may want somebody who's remote. So, which is important to you. Once you've ticked all those boxes, then you can narrow it down to the sorts of coaches that you're looking for, and then you go to work. You speak with them. I like to interview my clients. It's not about them choosing me; I'm choosing them as well. And so, if you have a coach that wants to make sure that you align with them as well, then I wouldn't be afraid of that. And I would perhaps make sure that you could have a trial period. It might work for 3 months, and then as you get into the weeds, you might find actually it's not working, that this coach is actually doing a lot of training themselves, and when they do their own training, they tend to lose sight of their athletes, and so you don't feel like you get as much attention. So having an opportunity to review the program after 3 months and decide whether you want to move forward with it or cut and run is a good option. I definitely, personally, I don't think the idea of contracts where somebody ties you into something where you're committed for 12 months works. If a relationship isn't working, you best both finishing it as soon as possible, not being committed. And certainly anything that ties you financially to a coach for a period of time, I'd be moving on from very quickly.
God, that's another source of stress you wouldn't need, huh?
Yeah, I mean, good coaches will charge good money and they will over deliver. And you want to make sure that, and that's because they're conscientious people and they want to do the best job. If somebody's only in it for the money, they will under deliver, and you can see through that very quickly. And so, as I say, if you follow Henry Ford's mantra, take your time about hiring the right coach, but if things aren't going very well, finish it as quickly as possible and move on, because you don't need that stress, and then find somebody else.
I like that. I like that a lot. And do you want to take a minute or two and tell us about what you have going on and how people can get involved and see if your programs might be right for them?
Yeah, well, I always like to leave myself in the position where I don't need to take on clients. And I would say that Brad Cairns and Andrew McNaughton have done several podcasts where they talk about coaching beliefs, and I found those quite interesting. And they share a similar philosophy to me, which is I like to help my athletes get to a point where they don't need me. I like to give them all the information so they could actually do it themselves. But then at that point, they choose to have me there in their corner because they feel like it would better having me in their corner than not having me there. I have a friend that I work with. We teach, and he has a client that says, "You're the best health insurance I've got." So
yeah, I like that.
And I like that philosophy as well, because this guy doesn't need. This guy could do it himself. He's a very smart bloke, but he chooses to have Rob in his corner because he thinks that adds some value. So I'm never in a position where I'm desperate to take on new athletes, but if somebody comes along and they're interesting to me and we get on and we chat away nicely to start with, I'll happily take somebody on because it's an interesting project, if you like, an interesting long-term project. So I have about a dozen one-to-one clients. I have as I say, I never say I've got a full list, but I never say I've got vacancies either. It just depends. For those people who don't, I mean, my fees are near the high end in the UK, but actually your US listeners are probably thinking my prices are quite low. I charge £200 to £250 a month for my fees, but I know there are coaches who are charging 2 or 3 times that much per month in the US. So it might seem like, I think that's just the differences, economic differences in different countries. So, but for those athletes who don't have a budget that extends to that monthly training, I also have a group called my SWAT Inner Circle, which is £30 a month, and for that they get pre-written programs by me. There's a big selection depending on the type of event they're doing and the amount of time they have to train. I make all of the resources that I've ever created accessible. We have a very good Facebook community group that's exclusive to those members. I think there's probably between 180 and 200 members at any one time. I have an assistant. Actually, you might have met Beth. She's based in the US, so she takes care of all the admin, the onboarding. She adds the programs, and then my role is then to be there for people who've got questions for me. They usually pose those on the Facebook page, but they can actually there's a link where they can arrange a phone call with me for 15 minutes if they've got any specific elements that they wish to review. So I can go into their into their Training Peaks account and have a look at what they're doing and give them some feedback on that, or talk them through a particular race. So those are my 2 main forms of coaching. And then I have a Facebook page which is called the Triathlon Coach Cafe, and that's free to join. And that is a community I've created and nurtured over the last 3 or 4 years. I think we have about 3,500 members now. We do ask people questions when they want to join. The first reason is to make sure that they're genuine triathletes and they want to gain something from being part of our group, gain knowledge or advice. I also want to make sure that their objective isn't just to come on and promote their business or to sell their products or to spam people. I don't want that. I also ask them what question they'd like to ask me, and that provides me with content then for writing blogs and doing podcasts and writing articles and doing little workshops, so I can give them a little bit more knowledge. And then we've got quite a lot of coaches on that page who, when somebody puts a question up there about how do I taper for an Ironman, for example, then there might be 10 or 15 people that are able to provide advice. So that's a nice little triathlon community that your listeners could join for free. And we've got, I don't know what percentages, but we've got quite a lot of US members now, quite a lot from Australia and Canada. Obviously, you've been a guest on my podcast, Mike.
Yes.
I've changed the name now to the High Performance Human Podcast because that's more in line with what I'm trying to do, to help people operate and perform well as humans rather than just athletes. It also enables me to interview people like yourself and people who've had different sorts of challenges, as well as the triathlon challenge. They've had different challenges in their lives. And it also enables me to interview experts from different fields and from different sports that triathletes might be interested in. So open water swimming, trail racing, adventure racing, that type of thing.
So makes it fun.
Those are the areas where people can find me. And of course, the podcast will give them an opportunity to find out a little bit more about my philosophies and how I sort of try to live my life and help people to sort of develop theirs.
And we'll have all of those in the notes and the show notes for everyone to check out and find you there. Simon, I appreciate you coming on the show today and chatting. I really like your philosophy. I really like your approach to this because it's much needed in a sport that is, I don't know, prone to carry a lot of stress and anxiety and type A. So you're much needed in this world.
Thank you, Mike. It's a pleasure to be on your show. Thanks for inviting me. And if you'd ever like me to come back again, just pick up the phone and ask, or ping me an email.
Alrighty, that concludes today's episode of the Age Groupies Podcast with me, Lindsay Hiken, and my co-host, Mike Ergo. We really hope you enjoyed it. You can follow the show on Instagram at Age Groupies, join our Age Groupies page on Facebook, and look us up by name, Lindsay Hiken and Mike Ergo on Strava. If you have questions, comments, or topic ideas, feel free to email us at agegroupies@gmail.com. If you enjoy the show, please leave a rating and review on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast, as this really helps us get more exposure while we try to grow this little venture. And of course, if you have friends you think might like the show, please be sure to share it with them. But for now, thanks for listening, and we will talk to you next week.